Welcome to my demonstration on Velly or Veldskoen. It's also known as the African field boot. I believe that's the translation or shoe. I also will have a translation of it called Velly or Veldskoen, which is the American bastardization of it. I've known quite a bit about gym greens for a few years. I just never bought any until their distribution network had an area in the United States, and it only costed $99 and I believe about $10 in shipping. I've had other Vellys before. I had a pair of Courtney boots, and I had a pair of Shire shoes that you might have seen in a past video. There's also another African boot, just because there'll be a bit of a trend in some of this, called the Waxi boot from the Commando store that I've tried, but I've never actually owned for a long period. That one's technically not a Velly though. The Courtney boots I think the Waxi boots were based more on Rhodesian war boots from the 70s and 80s, where they were looking for like a lightweight boot. And this will sort of lead into trends with African terrain being different than where you might be from, where there's some positives and negatives. Obviously, I'm talking about an entire continent here, but most of these companies are in southern Africa. And from what I've read on sort of African hunting type forums, is that you've got more flat terrain, so you're not going to see really, well, this is a stereotype, but you're not going to see as much hilly terrain like you might see somewhere like in the Northwest or in sort of mountainous climates. So their boots are more designed for that flat terrain, I would say, in my experience. And then, although it does tend to be pretty thorny, so it might be a reason why the outsoles tend to be pretty a decent amount of rubber there. One other thing too, I will say that I will lead to sort of a stereotype here with the African boots, is there's not as much rainfall, so might be something that's different to your area. I'll just do a little bit of a comparison between these companies, even though I don't have these other boots on hand anymore. The Waxi boot was a very thin leather, just for it to be lightweight during for its uses. I think it's technically a reproduction of a Rhodesian war boot. And then the Courtney boot as well, the leather with that one was, I wouldn't say that it was thin. I think it was game hides. I don't know if it was tanned more like vegetable tan. I don't think vegetable tans typically deal as well with water as a chrome tan will. But both of those boots, I was specifically the Courtney, which I had more experience with. I wouldn't wear it in the wet terrain, and since I live in the Pacific Northwest, I didn't really have a use for it. I think of the leathers, I think the gem green boot here is probably the most water resistant of it. I'm gonna guess it's more of a cowhide, and I'm gonna guess it's a chrome tan. Most of the water that happens on it either will just sit on it and then it'll just beat off of it. But this is just an exception to the other boots. You can see an area here where it's sort of soaked in. But I haven't applied any waterproofing, no silicone or fats or any other type of thing to top the leather off on the boot. I just wanted to make a point that sort of I'm comparing my experiences with the 4 boots. The Shire shoes I had were suede external, so they wouldn't deal well with water. But it's just something to keep in mind. I do think that this one probably has the best leather, in my opinion, it's the best leather of the other boots. The Waxi was pretty thin, just for the fact that it was sort of a lightweight boot, but with a decent enough sole for African terrain. And then Rhodesian war, and then the Courtney boots. I think they just use game hides. I can't remember. They've got a few different ones. I think they've got buffalo. There's another one I can't remember, unfortunately. But it's an animal. I think it's kudu. So, but I will say the negative is I do think of the other 2 companies I've been mentioning here, that this is the sort of just the weakest of the soles overall. I'll go into more detail when I just focus on the boot. With I think the Waxi boot had a pretty, like, they have an anti-tracking sole. I didn't use that one. I used more of the traditional, like, Vibram looking outsole with it. And I thought that one was a really great traditional sole. It wasn't too tall, which is sort of a thing I've been more concerned about recently. The Courtney boots had 3 different soles. I've tried the tire tread sole, and I've actually seen, I think, sandals in Africa where it looks like they literally just chopped off a tire and used the tracking on the bottom to make a sandal. But I think it's been said that the tire sole for Courtney boots lasts about 10,000 miles. That's just the sort of guesstimate. Obviously, there we go. So I've also tried their more flat, like, anti-tracking sole that you would see with the Waxi boot. I think it was called the Ripple sole. That one was really good too. I've actually suggested it to Courtney. I think they make some of the best outsoles, probably, and at least some of the best rubber outsoles that I've seen. One experience I've had with Vibram is that they keep testing these different materials. If you go on the Vibram catalog, you'll see that they'll show the materials, and I think the SBR is the standard for solid rubber, but the rubber soles tend to be slightly, they have less traction. They can be a little bit more slippy than other soles. So, I mean, it's probably something that would be fine in most gravel, but on, like, a wet, flat, concrete type surface, it could be a little bit slick as well. I believe Courtney has another outsole as well, so there's your balances as well. I wouldn't get Courtney just because I live in the Pacific Northwest, and I don't, the shoe boot I had, the Velly, was a little bit less water resistant than something like this was, or has been. So there's your plus, is the leather with these ones, and then your minus is going to be the just the outsole. I think this one has about the same traction as most of the Vibram soles I've used. It's just, you don't have the same, like, deep tread in there like you would get with a Vibram type sole. Okay, so moving on. I'm going to pull my pants down a little bit so I don't look like a schoolboy, if you're wanting that fashionista type of image. So I talked about the African terrain. I talked about the leather. I think the leather is about 5-6 ounces. I think they said it was 2.2 millimeters. Basically, most of your work boots in the United States, or most of your, like, the thick boy work boots that you're gonna pay $400 for, I think they're called, like, White's, Nick's. I forgot what the Canadian one is. I think it's Viberg. Wesco, gonna run about 7 to 8 ounces. Most of those, like, fire boots. So this is a little bit thinner, but I will say for an $100 boot, I think it's thicker than what most of the standard American work boots you're going to find in the U.S. The sort of Timberlands, Red Wings, maybe about the same for Red Wings. I think it's going to be bigger though than, like, Danner. I would say Danner's a little bit thinner. I'd say Danner's probably 4 to 5 ounce leather. But again, I'm pretty impressed for the leather, for the price especially. So the way I view this boot is, I think you could have 2 different perspectives on this type of boot. One is you're using it because you're buying the suede type of Velly. Usually with suede, you're going to absorb water easier, but it's going to breathe. I think it'd be about, like, it's going to feel like 5 degrees less in the boot. So I've also seen that suede can typically hide, like, a slash a little bit better. Whereas if I got a knife and cut this, you would probably see it forever. Most of these grain side leathers, you can't just rub them out. Some of them you can, but that's just the gist of it. So typically this shell here will do a little bit better job at holding in water, but once it gets wet, you're pretty much fucked anyways. But the way that the shell boot works is Basically, imagine it like a clothing system where you've got a base layer, mid layers for insulation, and an outer layer. The outer layer in this case is going to be leather. Now, most people that go outdoors aren't going to typically recommend you a leather jacket, but for boots specifically, you do need that sort of extra durability that it provides. And the boot will obviously give you like that shell in terms of resisting wind or the weather outside, which includes rainfall. So then as that sort of shell boot system works, then you're going to provide something as either a mid layer or base layer. Base layer, you might wear like a polyester inside sock and then a wool outside sock. You might wear 2 wool socks. You might have a sock and an insole. You've got all these different combinations, and obviously it's not just like a 3-layered thing, but with a shell boot, you're using more of a versatile system. I've noticed with a lot more of these American boots you have now, sort of, you've got all this technology shit that they're going to throw into here. They're going to say, well, it's waterproof, and they're going to throw Gore-Tex in there. And then they're going to add a liner as well. And then basically what that'll translate to is that it's going to take a lot longer for it to dry. And it might only work in like one condition, especially if you start adding something like Thinsole in there. Well, you can't. Some cases they can add removable Thinsole. So I think with the more shell boot theory, you've got something that you can just remove the part that's wet or not working. You know, if you don't need Gore-Tex, maybe if you've got like a Gore-Tex type sock, you can just remove that. If your socks are wet, you can change socks. If your shoes are wet and you know you're in the tent, you can put them up at night and they'll be dry in the morning because it doesn't have several layers. Those complex shoes tend to actually end up costing more too because they're adding all this extra technology shit. And then they have other problems down the road. Like one issue I've seen with Gore-Tex is, well, it won't last forever. 1, 2, you can trap water between the Gore-Tex and the leather layer, and it'll end up rotting the leather because it'll stay there longer than it needs to, because it's not just wicking it from the inside to the outside. So that's the thing with the shell boot. I think the thing with the shell boot type of system though is you need a really good design, because you need something that's going to be able to fit with a wider range of conditions. If I'm just using one sock and an insole, or 2 socks and an insole, or a sock and some type of boot liner or something like that. But more recently I've been more attracted to shell boots and the whole theory behind them than others. I have another example of a shell boot with me, the Norwegian M77 right here. Yep, you're gonna have to get the high quality picture photos here with the long 3-minute shot, but the Norwegian M77, it's just a layer of leather and then it's attached to an outsole. These shoes don't even come with an insole. You're basically supposed to add your own. Or the design behind them is that they're built bigger so that you add more layers of socks or more insoles underneath them for warmth. But what I mean by a good design is it would be nice to wear a shoe like this in 3-4 seasons, summer as well, by not wearing so much. Now, I've noticed, in my opinion, wool tends to be the best regulator. So I tend to use wool socks. For wide ranges, you can actually get away, in my opinion, with thicker wool in warmer conditions. It just will soak up more of that lovely juice. I'll probably talk more about the M77 in a minute here, but so yeah, that's my thought, is that basically though, when you're wearing a sort of like 2 socks or a sock and some type of boot liner, your foot ends up looking like a hoof. And one thing that's really nice about a boot like this, which tends to be about, I think this boot's about 4 inch, like I would call it about a 4-inch boot. Yeah, it's just under 4. Is it's easier to shove a hoof in there when you've got several layers of wool on. It'll go out really wide and you can just stick it in like that. When you get to like an 8 to 10 inch boot, I mean, even a 6-inch boot, I would say, yeah, I mean, you get more ankle support, but it can be a nuisance to actually get your foot in there with all the layers that you're wearing. Especially if it's unlined, you're going to end up getting friction between sort of the, that flesh, I think it's flesh side of the leather. So, I do really like using a boot like this for that reason. But again, if the design's not good, you're not going to be able to lace it for that wide range of conditions. And I'll go into design here in a minute. So, in my opinion, for the shell boots I've used now, with this M77, I almost wish that it was cut off to about 6 inches, 6 or 7. It's just too much of a nuisance to do that. You end up getting lacing problems when you have all these extra eyelets and studs to deal with as well, to get a really good firm lace with all that material. So again, I think 4 to 5 inches is an ideal, which is something like this would work pretty well for a wider range of conditions, even though it's made for a different geographic area than the one I live in. So I'm going to talk about the outsole. One of the reasons I showed the M77 is that the front of the outsole here, basically where it starts to go to your foot, it's about 15 millimeters, 15, 16. And then the back part here, hopefully I got that in frame, is about 30 right there. So you basically have about a 15 millimeter lift in the back here compared to the front. So, you know, the people that are talking about, I think, zero drop or whatever they call it, this is not that. The M77 is actually the exact same. It's about 30 lift in the back. Now this one doesn't have a midsole that's lifting, or it doesn't have the same type of design here, where you've got this external midsole here. This one might, I don't know. The midsole pretty much is stick to the same part that this area is here, but regardless, it's about a 15 millimeter lift in the back as well. One thing I will say now, since I have this out, I do like in more boot designs, when you're trying to land more in the front of the heel, I do like it when you get more of this sort of, I would call it a cowboy curve, where it just inches slightly inward from here to here. You'll see in some like type of mountaineering boots where it's a little bit taller of a heel than that, and it'll curve inwards. This one's more of a brick sole that you'll find this definitely more often in welted boots, but that's just personal preference. So 15 millimeter lift for people that are into that zero drop stuff. What I've read online, I found a really cool article on it, was that basically shoes with a higher drop will be easier on the lower leg, foot, and ankle, Achilles, and the calf, but it directs more stress to the knees and the hips. A lot of people now are can't really fix issues with the knee. Well, I mean, you can, but I would say it's a little bit harder to fix an issue with the knee, or probably the hips as well, down the road. Hence why there's this movement to sort of zero drop footwear. But at the same time, I think boots are still, in some cases, more comfortable, especially for something like standing. I don't think zero drop shoes, it's really hard to make one comfortable for standing, where you're trying to direct the pressure from the front to the back of the foot. Yep, basically you pick your poison on what you want. I do think that 15 millimeter lift, though, is a really good in-between. Some of the boots I've reviewed in the past, like the Australian redback boots, or Australian work boots is what they're called, they've had too big of a sole, or it's just been too clunky. I think I measured it. So both of these shoes are, like I said, about 30 millimeters, or about an inch and just under a quarter. I think the redbacks were about 1.5 inches. But at that point, it just felt like too clunky of a design. In terms of the outsole as well, one thing I really enjoy about both of these boots is, you might consider it a clown sole, but they've got this really wide sole. And I think you get some of these companies that are especially making like the foam footwear, like EVA or polyurethane, that are really tall because they just think, well, we need to add more cushion to make the person more comfortable. But in my opinion, when you make a wider boot like this, that actually is what leads to it being more comfortable. This really wide outsole is a lot more comfortable to stand on without adding all, like, you know, thick ass amounts of polyurethane in between it to cushion the shock of each, like, foot drop. So the sole reminds me of a crepe sole. I think Vibram also has one called the Christie Wedge. This sole will tend to discolor if that's important to you, with the sort of duck toe look, especially before it's broken in. It's going to, it reminds me of, there's another company I came across recently. It's a Danish-Polish company called Duck Feet. And I guess the name implies what it's going to look like, but, you know, it's a wider type of shoe. I think it's probably going to be a more comfortable shoe like this one, but you'll probably get the same. You'll end up getting discoloration from that. Those use a, what's it called? Crepe rubber, which is, I think, like a more corrugated type rubber. This one I believe is just a pure rubber block, like you'll find on a Vibram. One thing I'll say though with the sole as well, I tend to like these type of shoes more now than just the polyurethane. The M77 is one exception because typically with these shoes now you'll see either like a thick ass EVA foam, or you'll see the, like with the Australian boots, the thermoplastic polyurethane, and then the polyurethane midsole that makes them really tall. Whereas something like this, you can actually get a really durable outsole without it being super fat. Now the problem with this rubber is that it is heavier. Now I will say this is probably one of the lightest welted boots I've ever handled, but it's still going to be heavier than most of your foam type footwear. But what I really like about this design, and as well as with the M77, is this doesn't have to be your source of comfort. What you do is you just use the insole for your comfort. So if it's versatile like a shell boot, well, your comfort comes from the insole or from your socks. I mean, wool's pretty comfortable in itself. I can give you an example. Just the other day I was hiking in these, and I had this Swedish surplus insole that was made of wool, but it was really dense. So it wasn't actually very comfortable. This tends to be the one that I use now. Just find these at the feed and seed store, the Sneed store. About last time I got them, they were about $7. You can basically wear them as one mega thick boy. They're about 7-8 millimeters, or you can also just tear them in half, and then you've got two sets of wool outsoles. I think they usually run about $10 to $15, but they're extremely comfortable. So anyways, basically I do like it when you can have this not as tall outsole, but it's more, it's still just as durable as the ultra thick boys, you know, type of design. And then you just customize how you want your comfort to be, and the insole. So it allows you to customize as long as the design is good, like I said before. So anything else with the outsole? I don't think so. So, I guess I'll make one last point. With a lot of Vibram soles, they have some thinner outsoles that are just a pure brick of rubber. They kind of follow the same theme of the thicker polyurethane boots that you'll find on like Redbacks, where they're really tall, but what ends up happening is they end up gutting the part of the rubber that goes like past here. So if it's like what's the famous one, the Montana type of outsole, they'll put indents inside of the outsole here. So basically under here, just under where your heel is, they'll put indents and they'll say it's for weight saving, but the rubber's not comfortable in the first place by itself, so why the hell are you adding this extra height? You know, I know that you would have to adjust the sort of the design that they use. They'll have like a plastic foot, I forgot what it's called, off the top of my head, a last. They'll have a last in there, and they'll have to change it because the last is designed for a certain foot shape. So they'll have to design it for like a straight fit or high fit. But I don't know why you'd want to buy the Montana, because the rubber's heavier anyways, and you're just getting a taller outsole that's not as comfortable. So I just, personally, I don't like buying those or using those tall Vibram soles. They're just too damn heavy, you know, unless you need it for work. But they have, Vibram also has smaller ones. They have the Voyager, they have the Kletter, and then the 232, I believe. Maybe it's the 432, but that they don't have that indentation. So again, you can have this sort of not as tall design, and so it's a little bit lighter weight. Basically the gist of what I'm saying here is I wish there was more boots like this, where they either stitch the sole or they just glue it here to this midsole. There's definitely a few out there, but they're pretty boutique. There's like Native Earth. Well, some of the ones I've already mentioned. Courtney boots, I believe, are glued on. And all you have to do is rip the sole off. I think Duck Feet is the same. And then the cobbler could just glue a new one on. You know, I wish there was more sort of, what are they called, trail runner type shoes. I mean, I guess you wouldn't technically use it for running, instead of just all this foam crap that just ends up getting taller instead of wider. So the comfort on these, though, I think is really good. It's actually one of the most comfortable shoes or boots that I've worn. Okay, I'm gonna move on. The midsole here, I don't actually know what this is. That's either the thickest, some of the thickest leather. It might be like a vegetable tanned midsole. I don't really care too much as long as it doesn't absorb water. I will say it's one of the warmer boots I've actually had stock. Most of them tend to run cold because leather doesn't actually insulate very well. It just blocks what's coming from out from in, but they tend to run colder anyways when you're outside and you don't have that insulative backup. These ones, though, tend to run warmer, and I'm going to guess it might be this midsole here, or midsole. I wouldn't really have a concern with it, again, as long as it doesn't get wet. Yep. So I'm going to move on to the insole, though. I'm not a big fan of the midsole or insole. I think it's actually fairly comfortable. But what ends up happening is it's so warm in the toe, and there is elastic all in the front here. You know, this basic stuff that they'll put on the inside that you push it down, and it's going to bounce right back. A lot of people end up liking this because they don't want their front of their toes crushed. But it ends up getting so warm, and then whatever this material is here, I don't think it's wool. It doesn't feel like wool. It feels more like a sort of a polyester type of fill fabric. It ends up soaking up a lot of the water, and then it gets a little bit smelly, and once your foot starts getting wet, then it's going to start getting cold, so it ends up backfiring. Not the best. Again, it's comfortable probably because of the foam insert here, but it tends to absorb water like that. So that's my opinion on the insole. Once again, I'll probably just end up replacing it with a felt insole, unless this is just way more comfortable. But it depends on what you want to use the shoes for. You know, once again, do you want the suede shoe because you're in a warm environment, or do you want more of it to act like a shell boot? All right, I'm going to move on to the leather. Once again, I already talked about, you know, whether you'd want the suede out or the flesh side grain out, or the grain side, correction, outside. I already explained the difference between those. Again, it's about a 5-6 ounce leather. I think they say it's 2.2 millimeters. I already showed you it's fairly water resistant. I think it's cowhide. Again, I'm going to guess the reason why some of the other African boots aren't as water resistant is because they might not be chrome tanned, and it might be because they might be vegetable tanned leather, or it just might be the nature of the animals that they're getting their hide from. So last point I'm really going to focus on is going to be fit. I usually, if you've watched my extremely long video on fit, I typically will say like I don't really like the fit up in the front here because it ends up squishing the toes, and I don't think that's good for a long-term foot health. But I will say, I think you typically will get the sort of fit between here, sort of the top of your, what's this called? Arch, I would say. Sort of, so here, I would say sort of here between your heel and I guess your instep, and then your ankle. I think the ankle tends to be one of the lesser important ones, and it's one of the ones where the designs tend to suck. Anyways, it's not going to matter for this boot since it's only 4 inches. If you think you're going to get any sort of ankle support from this, I mean, all you're going to do is get a reminder that you're at the extremes of the boot. If your foot's twisting around, you'll have to go up another probably 5-inch minimum to start getting something that's going to support your ankle at all. I do think 5 tends to do a really good job at still giving your ankle some freedom, versus, you know, a 6-inch. I think 6 inches start getting a little bit sloppy in terms of the fit, just because a lot of times that ankle design's not as well executed between sort of the instep here and then the ankle here. So, but I'm going to do a cease and desist on that tangent, since this is only a 4-inch boot. Yeah, so you're not going to get any ankle support. I like a 3 eyelet. I like between a 2 to 4 eyelet boot. Usually 4 eyelet boots. I'm going to call this one a 4 eyelet because you got 4 of these quick laces. I'm actually not a big fan of these, but they work. Basically what my point is the more of these you have to start lacing up when you're lacing your boots, the more you're having to hold while you're sort of going to the next one. So you see when I released that one there, it sort of let up on that first eyelet there. So sometimes it's really hard when you're managing all these laces to get a really firm fit like that. And I've even seen that problem with 2 laces. One thing I forgot to mention earlier, oops, I just bumped that, is that the Velly came from Clark's, or no, it didn't came from it. Clark's Desert Boot was a British Army design based on this boot design during, I think, World War II, during their African campaign. But I'm going to put this on here. Basically, the Clark's Desert Boot uses, I think, typically 2 laces, or 2 eyelets on each side. You just need both of those to hold. With a lot of these boots, the more eyelets you get, the more I typically you'll see that you get this weird design. The most important part of the lacing, which I would typically say is like here and then here, tends to get looser, and you get this design where it sort of goes inward. So instead of it being sort of parallel, it tends to loosen, give a little bit too much slack. Now, someone might complain that they don't want that instep bite here, especially while they're breaking in. And I believe you can change your laces. You know, if you don't want that type of a bite for the boots that you're wearing. I believe these are just sort of paracord laces. They're pretty good. Most of the laces you get are just cotton trash. But I will say it does give some slack. I think there's a good reason that Clark's only goes with 2 eyelets on their boots, because when you go from there to there, it seems like no matter what I do, I end up getting more slack than I want. Again, I think you could change the laces. You could probably change the design. You could probably put this top lace here underneath. Usually I think that'll give you a thicker or a tighter bottom area. I don't really know what the fix is to that. I mean, I guess truthfully you could probably just do this sort of 2 lace and you might actually get a firmer fit from just doing that. Okay, so, but just to let you know, since I have these on, your water resistance, if you're like stepping in a puddle, is probably going to be up to here, about 2 inches up the boot here, just because it's not a gusset type design. like the M77 is, where that's completely attached. Now, none of these boots are really going to be waterproof because leather isn't waterproof. Even with as much silicone as you put into it, it's going to get wet at some point. It's going to end up seeping through the stitches, etc. So, basically, if you want that firm fit, I think you should go with 2 laces. I think if they were going to redesign this boot, I think for that third eyelet, I mean, it's just not going to push you down here. Now, I will say for fit, I think that most of these Chukka type designs have that like sort of a weak ankle here. They don't really lock in. Usually with like your 2-inch running shoe that cuts off here, it tends to actually just push in when you lace the boots, and that gives you a natural type of deal. This one actually has some type of support here that's sewn in, and it's better than probably any other type of 4-inch Velly Chukka type boot I've used for that when you do tighten it. But you do get some slack there in tightening. It's not as bad as like the redbacks, or if you wear what are they, like clogs. I think you're almost, your foot's supposed to just move up and down between it. So it just depends on how you really want the boots to fit. But again, I think if you want the firmest fit, you might actually just skip that third lace. If they were to redesign it though, I think this eyelet's too high up. I think you would almost just need a taller boot at this point. But if you really want it tight, you know, you want to push these 2 bottom laces here. And I think if you had a stud on that third lace, you'd be able to hold that bottom part while also hooking it up the top. Design like this with their studs, well, I would say, in my opinion, it's one too many eyelets. Once you get up to the studs, they actually hold the lace really well when you're trying to tighten it to the next eyelet or the next stud. So basically that's my opinion on the fit. Again, I think the design has to be good, especially for like a shell boot, that sort of versatility. I do like that there's plenty of spacing here. The problem with the M77s that I have is that there's just not enough of a gap there to tighten them much more than they already are. So this is better than most of the designs I've seen, but I still think it could use improvement, especially with this third eyelet here. Yeah, I do think if you're wanting a better upper design, I think Courtney does a pretty good job with theirs, but with Courtney at minimum, I think you're paying $160 to $200 on like African Sporting Creations or one of the American websites. So just one of these, just so you know, some of these videos I'll sort of make more for the manufacturer than I will for an audience. So that's just something I think that could use improvement. Certainly if this midsole's sucking up water, I think that could use improvement. I think the outsoles, again, I think the outsole's pretty great. I think it's about as good as most Vibrams. It's still going to be slick if you're on like a flat, wet surface. Sorry, that was out of frame. But I do think that the other sort of African boots I've seen have better outsoles. The Waxi boot and the Courtney boots, I think, have better outsoles. I think the fit's pretty good for a shell boot overall. I think actually this would work pretty well as like a LARP boot. If you're sort of, you know, trying to do some sort of historical representation. Unfortunately, it's got this tag here. They've got to put their branding all over the place, which I find kind of funny because nobody's going to see this anyways. So, and you're doing more stitching here, which can absorb more water through the stitching. So, but I guess you could black that out. So, you know, if you're trying to get your LARP on, I think it works. It's a pretty versatile looking leather boot that you'd be hard pressed to find something like that in America without all sorts of technology and other silly designs thrown into it for no reason. I think ideally for fit, more recently, my foot measures about 10 inches. For outsoles like these, I'll tend to just buy a size bigger. These are size 12, tend to be size 9. With my socks, probably barefoot, I'd be about size 8.5. but my foot measures about 10 inches to a 10.5. Now, obviously, the foot swells up the more you use it in the day. By the way, this insole is probably about an eighth longer of a gap in the front there. But basically, I've noticed that my foot measures about 10 inches. I tend to like about 2 inches more. So I probably would like about a 12-inch outsole. Because for design, I would usually like something, I would like something in the design where I could squat like a Slav. And certainly the heel here will support that just fine. And I would also like to be able to kneel on the front of the boot, sort of like where you're stepping like that. A lot of times you'll see when workers, and they end up getting, most people undersize their shoes, they end up just rubbing their toe in the ground, and then you end up putting all that pressure on your knee, which I'm sure isn't good. So I tend to like, if a shoe needs to be long enough to stand on that. Now, almost all those polyurethane shoes, this one's probably an exception. The lip here is basically meets the front, and then you get all these problems where you end up scuffing the front. People will sit on their toes, they'll scratch up the toes, and why not just have a shoe long enough that you could actually just kneel on your using your foot? So specifically for boots, I do like it. When it's long enough for that, I probably should have upsized on these for size 9. If anyone's curious, these boots are size 9. It's about 11 inches and 3/4. So I probably should have gone to 9.5 and 10, especially if I'm going to end up using these with with something else, even with more socks during winter. So the insole, it's going to say it's about 10.25, but it's actually about 11 total on the inside of the boot. Hopefully you can see that. Just for anyone looking for reference, again, I tend to like about 2 extra inches, I think, from the outsole to my foot. A lot of times I'll actually ask the manufacturer if they can just measure the outsole, so I can, do the squat and then the kneel. So again, for fit, I'd like the wide range of fitting, a wool sock and an insole, 2 wool socks and an insole, etc. Again, you'll probably get a bit of a clown shoe fit at first. You'll get something like, if you look up duck feet online. So again, I think the reinforcement in the heel here, I didn't show that earlier, probably won't show up well on the camera. It works better than most of these other ones. You do want, if you want your foot snug in there, this is what is probably the best design for this 4-inch type of boot, which typically isn't designed as a hiking boot. Usually with a hiking boot, you'll get somewhere like a Solomon or whatever they're called, that's about 5 inches, or you'll get something less. And then, yeah, the eyelets, again, I think the eyelets probably are what I would say needs the most improvement. Again, I would suggest the company go look at Courtney boots, probably talk to them. I think it could use a stud up here, maybe, or if they want more of an outdoor boot. I think Jim Green's other design, I forget what it's called, a Stockman maybe. It's just too clunky of a boot for my use. I would never use it unless it was like some silly end of the world boot. I like these type of lighter weight boots. I'd almost would rather have a sort of a combat Velly type of boot that's an inch longer, uses studs past this point. Again, I think Courtney has some pretty good designs for that. So I think that's about it. I think I've covered just about everything. Cheers.